That's a little too. Oh, that's even worse. Nope. Damn it. That's better. Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome back to my first sequel of the new year. Hopefully, this will be a better setup, and so hopefully the light isn't blasting me right in the face. I have it set up over here instead of directly behind the laptop, so it's just blasting me right in the face. Today, we will be discussing the first sequel in the Paranormal Activity franchise, Paranormal Activity 2, released in 2010. Because, to quote Jeremy Johns from way back in the day when he reviewed this, if your movie costs like $5,000 to make and it makes $100 million, yeah, there's going to be a sequel. Yeah, that's true. And it seems that, like, especially with horror movies, um, if a first movie is super successful, that guarantees sequels because horror movies don't cost very much to make for some reason, which has always made me confused. Like, why? Because they're more special effects. Whatever. That's beside the point. So, yes, indeed, Paranormal Activity 2. I'm not going to have much to say about this movie because even though I do have a fairly strong connection to this movie, I ultimately just don't have very much to say because, kind of mild spoiler, this isn't one of my favorites of the franchise. Um, like I said, I have a connection to it, but amongst the other Paranormal Activity films, this is kind of just the one that is the most meh, I feel towards. Um, but I'll explain that as I get into the review later. So, there's not much to say production wise about Paranormal Activity 2. Paramount and DreamWorks hired screenwriter Michael R. Perry to create Paranormal Activity 2. Oren Peli, the director of the first movie, served as a producer for this film. Uh, Kevin Grutart, the director of Saw 6, was initially hired to direct this movie. However, Lionsgate stepped in and forced him to stay on to direct Saw 7. Other directors were considered, like Brian De Palma, Akiva Goldsman, Brad Anderson, and Greg McLean, before they finally settled on a guy named Todd Williams. This is the most notable movie that Todd Williams has directed. Both Katie Featherston and Mika Sloat were brought back to reprise their roles for this movie. And the production for this started in May of 2010 and finished filming in only 3 weeks. That doesn't surprise me. That kind of, though, does cement one of my minor nitpicks that I have for this movie. I don't think this movie is rushed necessarily, but you can just tell that the studio was just like, okay, we have a hit here. The first movie made a shit ton of money, so let's just do all that all over again and make the same amount of money. And the film got pretty decent reviews. Hold on. Okay, hold on. It got fairly positive reviews, and it still made a shit ton of money. It made $177.5 million against a mere $3 million budget. Well, I say mere kind of lightly because considering the first movie technically costs only $215,000, but still, um, yeah, 177 million against a 3 million budget. Yeah, that's a success. um And yeah, that's pretty much it as far as production goes. Oh, Horror Metal is here. Oh, thank you for the shirt. This is actually the first shirt that Meadow ever bought for me back in 2018. So, my personal history with Paranormal Activity 2, kind of like the movie itself, it's a bit unremarkable, but technically speaking, this was the first Paranormal Activity movie that I ever saw. Not in full, however. But I did see the last half hour of this movie on TV the same night that I watched the first movie. It was actually, which is, well, no, because it's fitting. Um, I saw the last half hour of this movie on TV right before I watched the first half hour or so of the first movie on TV that same night. And it got me really intrigued. And like I said, at the time, I was still a big fan of ghost shows and paranormal shows. So, and I'd heard a lot of the buzz about Paranormal Activity movies because this was around 2013 or 14 or so when I saw these on TV. So I was still the franchise was still going on, and I was still very much interested in ghost stuff. So, yeah. But I did not see this movie in full until the next night after I saw the first Paranormal Activity movie when I was 19. And I enjoyed it, but I did not like it as much as the first movie. And that kind of seems to be the general consensus. I've tried to, excuse me, hang on. I've tried to look for Paranormal Activity fans, and I found a scant few, but the ones that it's not, no. It's not a bad movie by any means. So let me get this out of the way. I don't dislike this movie in the slightest. I think it's a good sequel. It's more well made. It looks more professional. Um, it does good things that a good sequel should do. So it is a good movie, but I don't find it to be nearly as engaging as the first movie, and I kinda have to, even though I'm on very shaky terms with this guy's channel at the moment, but I kinda have to agree with James A. Janice from channel Dead Meat. A couple years ago, he did a series called Paranormal Pool Party for his it's a funny name, for his, podcast section on his channel, where he and his then girlfriend were talking about the Paranormal Activity movies, who's now his wife. Um, and they had a guest speaker on, and that chick's name was, I think, Clark Wolf. She stated this was her favorite of the first 3 movies, and James retorted by saying it was his least favorite of the first 3 movies. I have to fall into that category. This is definitely my least favorite of the first 3 Paranormal Activity movies. Not a bad thing by any means, but of the first 3 movies, this definitely has middle chapter syndrome in my opinion. While it's technically a good movie, it's just not quite as entertaining or engaging or thrilling as the first movie. And unfortunately, a big problem that this movie has, I'll quote Jackie Boy by saying, simply for right now, before I get into my pros and cons, I think this movie has Chris Columbus syndrome. With that being said, I'm just going to move on. Again, I do like this movie. It's a good sequel. It's not a bad movie in the slightest, but it is one of my lesser favorites of the entire franchise. And I did not enjoy it quite as much as the first film. But with all that being said, Paranormal Activity 2 is a 2010 American found footage supernatural horror film directed by Todd Williams and written by Michael R. Perry, with Christopher Landon making his debut in the Paranormal Activity franchise. Chris Landon would later on become more well known for directing the Happy Death Day movies and Freaky. Horror and metal, you're a big fan of Freaky, so that movie's director has a lot of ties to this franchise, so maybe that'll intrigue you. Um, the film is actually a prequel to the first Paranormal Activity movie, beginning technically 1 year, but specifically 2 months before and following up with the events depicted in the original movie. Um, it was released in theaters on October 22nd, 2010, in the United States. Paranormal Activity was kind of the franchise that filled in the Saw franchise's shoes for a few years, because it was around this time when the Saw series was coming to its end. Um, I think 2010 saw the release of the sixth Saw movie or the seventh Saw movie. I can't quite remember, but the Saw series was starting to wind down, and I remember that actually because the marketing around this was pretty heavy. Like they were capitalizing on the fact that because Saw was ending, the Paranormal Activity franchise was starting to come in and fill its shoes for the next few years. Every October, there was a Saw movie for 7 years. And then after this, usually every October, but at least once a year, um, there's a Paranormal Activity movie, except for the sixth film, but we'll get to Ghost Dimension in due time. So let's get to the plot of Paranormal Activity 2. Oh, one last thing as well. A little story that I have. Um, so in my, friend and family group, except for my brother, but he's a fan of these movies because of me. The only other person that I had in my life that has some kind of connection, and I don't bring up this story to like oust him or anything. It is a funny story, because it's always stuck in my mind. It's one of the biggest things that I attribute this movie to. So my friend Nate, who actually lived with me at my grandparents' place, for my fans of the channel from way back in the day in like 2016 and 2017, he lived with us for a while, and I asked him one time, what's one scary movie that actually scared you the most? And he's not a huge fan of horror films, probably because of this experience, but he told me that one movie that he always remembered scaring him the most was Paranormal Activity 2. He watched it on TV in full, and he said the movie scared him so bad that he actually stayed up in his living room sitting on the couch with all the lights on, surrounded by his dogs, because he was so afraid to go to sleep. Again, not to oust my friend Nate or anything, but it's kind of a funny story. I'm sure everybody who's watched a scary movie has stayed up having trouble sleeping with all the lights on in their room because they're so freaked out. um, I've done it a few times myself. So yeah, with all that being said, um, let us get into the plot of Paranormal Activity 2. In August of 2006, a burglary occurs at the home of Christy, played by Sprague Graydon. The only other thing I've seen her in is that she was Opie's wife in. Oh, really? I didn't know that. She played Opie's wife, Donna, in the show Sons of Anarchy. She was in the first season, gunned the fuck down in episode 12. Excuse me. And Daniel Ray, played by Brian Boland, trashing their house and leaving only their infant son Hunter's bedroom untouched, which is spooky. And I feel like that might be a reference to The Exorcist. The only thing stolen is a necklace that Christie's sister, Katie, gave to her. We, of course, in this movie, we learn who Katie's sister is named. It's Christy, because her name was never spoken in the first movie. She just said, "I have a sister," but her name was never given. Martine, the Latin American family housekeeper and nanny, senses evil spirits in the house and burns sage to rid the house of them, and Daniel fires her for doing so. Christy also believes that their home is haunted, and she and Katie talk about being tormented by a demon when they were children. Daniel, however, initially dismisses her claim despite footage of strange occurrences around the house. Daniel's daughter from a prior marriage, Allie, played by Molly Ephraim, I think her name is, she played Mandy Baxter on the ABC sitcom Last Man Standing during its original run. She begins investigating the mysterious happenings and she discovers that humans can make deals with demons for wealth or power by forfeiting the soul of their firstborn son. But if the deal is not fulfilled, the demon will stick to the family until another son is born. Hunter is the first male to be born on Christie's side of the family since the 1930s. Excuse me. The violence escalates as the family's German Shepherd dog Abby is attacked by the demon and apparently suffers from a seizure. As Daniel and Allie take Abby to the veterinarian, Christy is attacked and dragged into the basement by the demon possessing her. The following day, Allie is left home with Christy, unaware she is possessed. Soon, Allie hears a scratch sound in the basement door and opens it to find scratches. I'm just now learning this. I did not know that this was a thing in the movie. She sees a word, "meus," I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a Latin word for mine, etched into the door. A strange bite mark on her leg and the footage of Christie's attack motivates Daniel to pull his head out of his ass and rehire Martine, who prepares a cross to exorcise the demon. Christie will have no memory of having been possessed. Daniel goes to pass the demon onto Katie so that Christie and Hunter will be saved, despite Allie's pleas to not do so. That night, when Daniel tries to use the cross on Christie, she attacks him and the house lights all go out. Using a handheld camera's night vision, he walks around the shaking house into the basement where he is attacked by Christie, but he retaliates against her with the cross, causing her to collapse. Daniel puts Christie to bed and burns a photo of a young Katie, passing the demon onto her in kind of a real dick move. 3 weeks later, Katie visits and explains that strange things have been happening at her house. On October 9th, the night after Mika is killed, a possessed and bloodstained Katie breaks into the Ray house, kills Daniel and Christy, and then takes Hunter with her. Allie comes home from a school trip to find the corpses, and Katie and Hunter went missing, ending in a very similar fashion in a bleak, downbeat note to the first movie. I better not be catching another cold. Excuse me. So, how about this story? Well, word has been spoken. It is a good sequel. It does a lot of good things right. It does a lot of good things that sequels should do. It expands the lore, it adds more to the mythology, and it gives more context to the kind of vague story that the first movie hinted at in a good way. But like I said about the first movie, it plants these little seeds. And this movie does a good job of taking advantage of those seeds and adding more to them. I do want to talk about this a little more, so that's all I'll say for now. But it is good. It's a good continuation. Well, because it's a technically a prequel. Well, yeah, I would say it's a good continuation. It feels like the first movie, maybe a little too much. Um Again, it's a good sequel, but just for me, it's a little too similar. And that's all I'll say about that for right now, too. That's good. So, excuse me. With all that being said, let us get into the pros and cons of Paranormal Activity 2. Pro number one is the characters of Christy and Allie. Christy is very likable. She's very sympathetic, even though she is, I don't think even remotely similar look appearance wise to Katie. Hold on one quick second. Oh shit! God damn it! Still getting used to this touchscreen. Okay, cool. Okay, here we go. Okay, yeah. I don't think Christy and Katie look even remotely similar, but still, I think their sisterly bond and sisterly chemistry is very believable and strong. The way that these two talk to each other, it's very playful, it's very familial, it's very warm and loving. Um, like you can tell that these two are very, very, very close siblings, and you two get kind of swept up in their, familial love. It's very sweet and it's very convincing and believable. I love it. Um, as a guy who has two siblings myself, even though unfortunately my relationship with one now is pretty strained, I do very much enjoy being the fun, loving, supportive older brother. And I definitely buy the relationship that Katie and Christy have. I think it's pretty believable, and I think it's very sweet. Um, so not much to say about those two. And the character of Allie, David's daughter, um, I'll save that for a minute. But she's also she's very likable. Um, she's very proactive. She's pretty quick to pick up on the fact that there are some weird things going on around the house, and she's intuitive and smart enough to know how to, check the cameras, check for footage, check for body language, and actually do research into, Katie and Christie's family line, looking up demons, looking up hauntings. She doesn't just claim that paranormal activity is going on. She looks for evidence first, and she researches for evidence to back up her claims, which is something I don't, well, I mean, it kind of is, but it's not done in such a way like this. The characters in other ghost movies, I don't feel like are as intelligent as Allie. Um, she tries always to show evidence to try to prove what she's talking about could be true. And I think it's very convincing and well done. Um, Yeah, Allie's a very likable character. She's very believable, she's very intuitive, she's very intelligent, and because of that, I think that's what makes her such a likable character. It is such a shame that she's one of few characters in the entire Paranormal Activity franchise that actually survives, because a lot of these movies tend to end with everybody dying, but she's a rare survivor, but it's unfortunate that never came back except for one scene in the 5th film, but still, and there it is cool. But yeah, Christy and Allie are very likable characters, and I think they are definitely the main characters of this movie, and it's a good thing that they're so likable. Pro number 2 is the good family dynamic. This might be like a weird pro, but I really like how the family acts in this movie. Um, well, I'll talk about that in just a minute. So I have step parents. My parents divorced when I was about 4 or 5 years old. So I grew up with step parents. And unfortunately, I was kind of a problem stepchild. I'm not now. Like, I love my step parents, specifically towards my stepmom. Like, I'm sure everybody has heard so many horror stories, and especially nowadays, people experience having step parents because, parents don't stay together nearly as much nowadays. So a lot more people have step parents. I was one of those kids, and for a long time, I hated it. But specifically now, like with my stepmom, I adore my stepmom. I call her mom because in a lot of ways she was my mom for a long time. Nothing to take away from my actual mom, love her to death too. But I appreciate seeing in this movie Christy and Allie have a very strong relationship. Um, Allie has a good relationship with her stepmom. It's very warm, it's very loving. There's no tension, there's no animosity, there's no problems between the two. And this movie very, very easily could have written right off the bat that Allie and Christy don't get along. Be a typical step parent, stepdaughter type thing. But they don't, and I applaud this movie for doing that. I don't really see that very often in movies about step parents because usually the step parents are just assholes. But overall, outside of Christy and Allie's relationship, because the family dynamic here is so strong, like David is a dumbass as far as I'm concerned. He kind of has Mika syndrome, which I'll talk about later. But David, as a patriarch for the family, Um, he's not an asshole, thankfully, towards his family. He's also very warm. He's very understanding. He's very loving. He's very supportive and protective. Um, like he loves his daughter, of course. He loves Christy. He loves his son Hunter. And um he's also very loving and warm to Katie as well. There's a couple scenes when Katie and Mika come over to visit David and Christy, and they're all just hanging out, having fun. David gives Katie a hug, but it's not in a sexual way. It's just a loving family way. Um, David and Mika, they do the bro hugs, which is fun to watch. Just the family dynamic, and everybody is very close. Everyone's very loving, and and all that. It's very well written and it's very believable in my opinion. I'm sure it probably helped that everybody did get along on set, especially with Christopher Landon being involved in some way. Um, it kind of bleeds out of the screen and it seeps into you. And especially nowadays, I love hanging out with my family and we all try to get along and just laugh and joke and enjoy each other's company. And it's fun to watch in this movie. And it's effective in making the scares more impactful later in the movie because the family dynamic is so strong. That's what makes it a little more heartbreaking and a little more tragic at the end of this movie when David and Christy are brutally killed and this family dynamic is completely torn apart and destroyed. And that makes the ending even more bleak and fucked up, in my opinion, now that I think about it. But as the movie goes on, as the tensions rise and shit escalates, it's more believable and impactful because the family dynamic is so strong. Those bonds are starting to weaken because of these fucked up events. So I love the family dynamic in this movie. It's very, very well done. And I just eat it up whenever it's on screen. It's one of my favorite things about this movie, actually. Pro number 3 is, this movie has way better production value, and it also has, one of the best setups for a camera system, in my opinion. So the first movie, it's fine, it's only 1 camera, and the setup is Mika that wants, because that is one thing that a lot of people criticize about later Paranormal Activity movies and found footage movies in general, because people ask, why are they filming in the first place? Why is this a found footage movie? Why do they always have to keep filming? Like, what the fuck? This setup makes no sense. They're just making a found footage movie for the sake of a found footage movie. That is something that is also very difficult to get right with found footage movies, is that they have to justify the camera setup. Sometimes they do it well, other times they just do it for the sake of doing it. Like with The Gallows, probably the worst example. Excuse me. But with this movie, I think it is pretty damn well done. It starts out with just a loving family documenting the coming home of a little boy. Which, side note, the first 5 minutes of this movie strongly resonate with me because I've actually been through bringing a new baby home and showing them around to the new house and acclimating to being a new parent. It's both good and bad. Um, but I really appreciate that setup, and then with the break-in, that strongly justifies. So there's one handheld camera, and there's, I believe, there's the front door, the pool, the inside of the front door, the kitchen, the living room. Yeah, 6 cameras, and then Hunter's room. There's 6 security cameras all over the house because after the break-in, David decides that he wants to set up security cameras. So it is well justified, and there's not really any reason throughout the movie that people should be saying, "Why are the cameras here? How is this shot captured?" And just overall, because this movie had a much bigger budget than the first movie. Now, I don't think this is a problem per se with the first movie, but you can tell sometimes that it costs $15,000. With this movie, it does show its $3 million budget. There's more cameras, there's more supernatural stuff that's done. There's just a little more ambition that's thrown into this movie, and I think it shows very well. Um, and I just appreciate the larger production value. That's really all I have to say. Yeah. And also, more characters in this movie. They could hire more actors and have the movie be more about than just 2 people for a good chunk of the movie. Now, again, it works in the first movie because they were doing as much as they could with so little resources. It's fine in the context of the first movie, but had they tried to do that all over again with this movie, I don't think it would have worked nearly as well. So hiring more actors, having some more characters liven up the movie, it gives it this bigger and better and more polished feel, which is nice. Oh, it's a truck. Hopefully, you guys don't hear that. Pro number 4 is the suspense in this movie is not as strong, Not quite as strong as the first movie, but it is on a similar scale. There's a lot of long, quiet takes. There's a lot of long, lingering shots on parts of the house where at first you don't see anything, but then something paranormal subtly happens in the background, and that makes you pay it. It makes you similar to Signs. It kind of makes you wary of long shots. So then you're wondering, oh shit, what's going to happen? And similar to the first movie, after a while, it kind of gets you to grip your chair in anticipation, um, which is good. Again, the suspense is not quite as strong as the first film, but it's among a similar line, and it's very well done too. Um, this movie essentially is doing anything that the first movie did, just with a bigger budget, which I appreciate. It's good for consistency. And something that James and Chelsea pointed out in their podcast video on this movie, I appreciate that because this technically is a prequel, they don't add any new bullshit abilities that the demon can do. Uh, and then that retroactively makes people ask, well, if this demon could do this in this movie, and this is before the first film, why doesn't it do that in the first movie? It doesn't do that. The demon does all the same things that well, this will lead me into the next pro. Pro number 5 is there are some good scares in this movie, in my opinion. Um, there's some good jump scares. There's some good like freak out moments. Um, so what I was gonna say, this movie does the demon in this movie does all of the same things that the demon did in the first movie. You know, make stuff move, um, do bangs on a floor or wall to make noise. They still use that exact same screeching sound effect from the demon in the first movie. People get dragged. Uh, People get levitated. There's another bite mark on Christie in this movie. The demon does all the same things that it did in the first film on a bigger scale because this movie had more money to play with. But it still feels very consistent. This feels exactly like the same demon from the first movie. Um, and I actually kind of do. So, one thing that I can see people asking is because right off the bat, this demon feels stronger than the first film. Like um in one freak out scene when oh wait, I should probably well yeah, I'll get to that in just a minute. So in one big freak out scene, Christy gets really spooked when she's down in the kitchen. So she runs up to oh, it's when she gets possessed. When she gets possessed, she gets spooked and she tries to run up to Hunter's room, but then out of nowhere she gets flipped down and dragged by an invisible force. She tries to grab onto a stair rail and she's like being pulled up in the air. Like her legs are straight up in the air, like something's trying to pull her. It lets her go, so she drops and she tries to run, but then she gets flipped again and dragged down the stairs, um, and just yanked right into the basement. But in the first movie, Katie gets pulled out of her bed and dragged down the hall. It's a similar thing, but it's not quite as fast and it's not quite as sudden. So some people might wonder why didn't the demon just do what it did to Christy in the first movie all over again? I kind of theorize that a reason why the haunting is very subtle at first in the first film and why the demon is not quite doesn't seem to be quite as strong as it was in the second movie I theorize because of the exorcism, um, maybe that kinda zapped the demon of a lot of its power. Hold on. And it had to take that time in the first movie to build fear and to build its own power so it can do what it needs to do. So I that's my theory as to why there is somewhat of a difference between the demons in this movie and in the first film, is that maybe it's not quite as strong because it was exercised and transferred from Katie to Christy. Ugh. And also, because this movie takes place over the course of a couple months, whereas the first movie took place over the course of 3 weeks. So with this movie, it had a little more time to build its power and build up fear so that it could do more shit. So that's my theory. But the scares still overall are quite strong. There's a couple good creepy moments. Like I noticed this on my most recent rewatch that I never saw before watching this movie. One of the first, actually, I think it's the first paranormal thing that happens in the movie, aside from Hunter's high chair getting knocked over, but Christy just kind of blows it off like maybe. And I know this has happened because I've dealt with this before. Christy goes to pick up Hunter out of his high chair because he's having a snack. She goes to pick him up, and then she moves to go take him for a nap, and then his high chair, it gets knocked over, but she blows it off like either Hunter just kicked it over as she was walking away, or maybe his leg got snagged, and it just pulled the high chair over. I can believe that as actually being a thing because I've done that a couple times accidentally. When Roman was a little too wiggly with his legs, pulling him out of his high chair, he kicked over his high chair one time and he got snagged as I was pulling him out. His leg got caught on his tray and he just pulled it over. That's happened before. But the audience knows no, that was the goat. That was the demon. That was the demon without a doubt. But the first major thing that is paranormal that happens, there's a shot of Hunter sleeping in his bed at night, and in the corner there's like it's a closet door, kind of like this, but it's a mirror. It's a big mirror. Um you can see like something is pressing on the mirror because you can see the image that the mirror is reflecting. It kind of flexes and warps like somebody is pressing on the mirror in the middle to make it flex. Um, it's very subtle, but it is kind of spooky. And I never noticed it before until my most recent rewatch. Um, there's not as many scares throughout the first two-thirds of the movie, but obviously the most iconic scare from this entire movie, Christy is by herself in the house, sitting in the kitchen. It's quiet. She's all by herself. She hears like a tapping noise. And at this point, Christy has noticed some of the paranormal activity that's been going on. So at this point in the movie, she is pretty spooked. So she gets a little spooked. And then all of a sudden, you snap your fingers, all of the cabinets, all of the drawers, and a whole bunch of pots and pans just boom all over the kitchen. And she just sits there like, "Oh my god!" And once the kitchen explodes, she's just sitting there like, and then she gets out of her chair and she just runs back up to her bedroom. It's a very well done scare, in my opinion. It feels a little reminiscent of the movie Poltergeist, which I like. But it's so sudden and it's so loud and explosive. I almost pissed myself when I first saw this movie. I shit you not. Um, the biggest scare in this movie until the third act when Christy is possessed. Also, when she gets dragged down to the basement, that's a pretty freaky moment. And when right as she zips into the basement and the door slams shut, you hear the demon scream, which is also a good freak out moment. But um, there's a scene later. This is a good creepy moment because you can instantly tell the difference between Christie's personality. Because beforehand, Christy had no problem with anybody just going over to, kiss Hunter, pat his head, or pick him up and hug him or hold him. But once she's possessed, there's a scene when Allie is like trying to peek at Christy with the camera. She notices the bite mark on her thigh and she gets spooked, so she pulls away. But then she peeks back into Hunter's room. Christy's nowhere to be seen. So she goes in and she just sees Hunter like hanging out of his crib, like, "What up? What's going on?" So Allie gets a little spooked, so she sets the camera down. She goes to pick up Hunter, and then Christy comes out of nowhere in the snap of a finger, and she very nastily says, "Don't touch him!" And Allie gets spooked and she runs away. Um, and then once David sees the footage of Christy being hauled down into the basement, that's when he's finally convinced of what's been going on in the house. And the scene when he tries to exorcise Christy down in the basement, it's pretty freaky shit. Um, there's lots of loud demon screeching. You see Christie's demon face a couple times. There's a couple good jump scares of Christie popping out of nowhere and like shoving David down or just zipping past him. Um, and when he finally exercises Christie, there's a big, loud, rumbling, almost it's an earthquake essentially, but it's like the demon is leaving the house and going over to Katie. Um, it's very loud, it's very bombastic and freaky, and it leaves a lot to the imagination because all you see is the camera on the ground looking at like a dresser or some kind of box, but you see like dust and dirt just violently rumbling and vibrating on the ground. And then all of a sudden it goes dead silent until you hear David pick the camera back up and see Christy and send her to bed. Um, yeah, the scares are pretty intense. They're much louder and much more bombastic than the first movie. They're not quite as effective as the first film, in my opinion, but they're still good jump scares, and this movie does still have fairly decent suspense. Pro number 6 is the special effects in this movie are good. Um Again, a lot of the same stuff that was done in the first movie, stuff being moved, so they either use CGI or simple strings or just simple effects. There is one creepy scene when you see Hunter in his bed. This is a little distressing for myself because I don't like seeing kids in any way being, messed with in horror movies. But the demon is slowly like pulling Hunter down his bed, which wakes him up and he starts crying. And then they cut to an another shot, and then they go back to his room, and Hunter is being pulled up the side of his crib. I believe so. When Hunter is being pulled when he's in his bed, that was actually Hunter. But when he's being pulled up the side, I'm pretty sure they used a puppet or some kind of animatronic. But it is an effective scare and like an effective freak out scene because you kind of can't tell because he's a toddler. He's not really needed to move and do anything dynamic. They just kind of need him to flail his arms around in a freaked out motion like kids do. So it's effective, but I guess it was a puppet or some kind of animatronic. So that was effective. How they got the kitchen to explode, I don't know. It was probably some CGI and some practical effects. But it's effective. And when Christy is pulled out of the room and yanked into the basement, I think they used strings with some CGI. I think it's well done. It's a very convincing effect. It looks like Christy is actually being dragged by an invisible force. It's fucking freaky. There's one scare too when Allie is sleeping on the couch babysitting Hunter. She falls asleep, and while she's asleep, you hear it's a shot of the living room. She's laying on the couch. The TV was like playing some kind of infomercial, but then it goes dead, and then you hear static, and you hear this low rumbling sound, and you see a shadow slowly move its way. Hold on. Slowly move its way to cover Allie, and it like covers her entire body, and then you hear like this popping noise. The shadow disappears, and the TV comes back on. So it's like she woke up from a nightmare, but the shadow, I believe, was CGI, but it's well done. It's effectively freaky. Um, so yeah, the effects are still good. In some ways, they're an improvement over the first movie, but they're still simply done. Still keeping the motto of doing more with less, which is good. Excuse me. Pro number 7 is the good world building in this film. Like I said earlier, this movie does a good job of taking advantage of the little seeds that are sprinkled in the first movie and expanding on them. Specifically, the lore of the demon. There it is. Oh my god. Um, yeah, expanding on the lore of the demon, adding more to Katie and Christie's family tree, and planting the seed that yeah, this demon, what it wants is Hunter. Also explaining where the burnt photo of Katie came from, the same photo of Katie that Daniel burned in order to pass the demon on to Katie. That's the same photo that's found in the attic in the first movie, which is a good explanation. And also, this movie more so talks about it, like plants a little more seeds and it gives more context into what Katie and Christy went through as they were kids, which the third movie even more so expands on. So this movie also does a good job of planting seeds, but this movie adds more context to the mythology, and it expands the lore and gives it more interesting backstory and plants more seeds, which is something that good sequels should do. It doesn't feel forced, and the movie doesn't feel like Batman versus Superman, where it stops the movie just to plant seeds for future movies to take advantage of. This movie does it more subtle. It doesn't take away from the movie's story, or at least it doesn't halt it. It actually adds itself to the movie's story and adds more to the franchise's mythology, which is how good world building should be done. And the final pro that I have for this movie, pro number 8, is the once again very ballsy ending. It's like a good surprise seeing that this movie's ending takes place right after the events of the first movie. Katie's still wearing the same shorts and bloody tank top. She comes over to the house. Um, okay, hold on one second, guys. I will be right back. I gotta use the bathroom. So that's definitely something to edit. Whew, damn. Okay, note to self: don't ever drink two propels before starting a video. Okay, pardon me, guys. Yeah, the ballsy ending. So, yeah, Katie comes over seemingly right after killing Mika. She's in the same clothes. All of a sudden, she appears in David's living room while David is sitting on the couch watching TV. She comes out of nowhere and just violently grabs him by the head and yanks him up and just snaps his neck. Just like, poof, and he drops dead. And then, so Christy is holding Hunter in his room, and she hears like a loud thump. You see Katie still standing in the living room, like turn her head like the Terminator. Then a shot in Hunter's room. You see Katie just come um, tear assing her way into Hunter's room, and then she just blasts Katie right into the camera, and just she falls dead, similar to how Mika died in the first movie. And she just stands there, like, just very cold and very evil looking. Then she picks up Hunter, whom I think again might have been a puppet because he was or she was holding him pretty roughly. And as he's kind of crying and grunting, Katie just leaves the house without a word, never to be seen again until the fourth movie. And yeah, there's end text that states that Allie came home from a school trip and found the dead bodies of her family and her little brother missing. It's similar to the first movie, and it ends in a very cold, very bleak, very hopeless and empty feeling, like with the first movie. And it's also just very ballsy and shocking to see Katie just violently kill two important members of her family just like that without even flinching. It's kind of unsettling and very spine tingling, in my opinion. So, with all of these good things to say about Paranormal Activity 2, I have four cons, unfortunately. And one is a bit minor. So, con number one, I think this movie has too many useless shots. In that, so there's technically seven cameras in this movie, one handheld, and six security cameras all throughout the house. And every time there's a transition from like night one, night three, night five, so on and so forth. It begins with an exterior shot of the front door and then a shot of the backyard pool. Nothing ever happens in the front door and the pool except for with the pool halfway through, when the lights turn off and when you see a ladybug pool cleaner magically pull itself out of the pool onto the sidewalk, and then the front exterior shot, the only thing that happens is when you see Katie walk away slathered in blood carrying Hunter. But there's so many shots in this movie where nothing ever happens. And I don't mean to sound like I want every shot in the movie to have something paranormal happen, but it feels like the filmmakers were padding this movie out for runtime, unfortunately, by having so many shots where nothing happens. It just feels kind of cheap. And a lot of times the movie will cut to those useless shots very frequently and very quickly too. Like something will happen in the movie, or like so establishing shot, something minor happens next night with next establishing shot. Then something happens and then cut to another establishing shot with nothing happening. It's like stop go, stop go, stop go, stop go. It just gets a little tiring, and toward the third act it just gets a little old when they just keep doing this stop go, stop go, stop go. Once the third act rolls around, they don't do that really anymore. Like once shit starts hitting the fan, thankfully, the movie gets going. That'll lead me to another problem. But yeah, I just think there are a little too many useless shots in this movie, which is a little annoying. Con number two is David. So I see what they're doing with David. He's like Mika. He doesn't believe any of the stuff that's going on in the house, and he doesn't believe even when three people are telling him, yo, there's stuff happening in this house. David is just very dismissive. He's very skeptical, and he's kind of a dick about it for a good chunk of this movie. He just like outright refuses to believe when both Christy and Allie are telling him there's something going on. There's something happening in our house, and we have footage to show you. And even when he sees footage of stuff happening, he's just very dismissive and thinks that it's fake. Only when Christy is dragged out of Hunter's room and into the basement, when he finally pulls his head out of his ass and starts to pay attention and believe. And some people have tried to say that David is a non believer because this movie is secretly about gaslighting. Like David is gaslighting Christy and Allie throughout most of the movie because he refuses to believe what's going on. I personally don't subscribe to this theory. I can see where they're coming from, and I do think it kind of does hold some water, but I don't think that's what they were doing with the character of David in this movie specifically, because of something that has to do with my biggest problem with this movie. But David is a very frustrating character, not quite as frustrating as Mika, but he's of that similar type. He just does not believe the main characters when it's a typical ghost movie character. There's always that one skeptic who's just a dick and refuses to believe whatever's going on until there's irrefutable evidence slamming him right in the eyes or right between the eyes. Like, yep, this is no longer something you can deny. This is actually happening and this is actually going on. And it's only in the last 25 minutes or so when David is finally a believer. This will kind of lead me into con number three. Most of the scares and the paranormal activity and the shit hitting the fan is saved for the third act. This movie doesn't escalate stuff nearly as strongly as the first film does. It doesn't feel gradual and incremental. Like it doesn't gradually build over the course of the movie. It just kind of plods along and gets a little higher, and then gets a little higher, and then finally in the last half an hour or so is when shit really hits the fan. And it just goes up to 99. Um, it just feels a bit too much like the filmmakers just wanted to save all the crazy shit for the end and just felt kind of like, we'll just add a couple things here and there to spruce up the scares in the first two acts. It's not necessarily a huge problem because this movie has a good family dynamic and of the world building that this movie does. It still makes the first two acts entertaining and engaging, but in terms of scares, this movie doesn't offer up very much except for the last half an hour, which is a little disappointing. But without a shadow of a doubt, this movie's biggest problem is that it has Chris Columbus syndrome. Thank you, Jackie Boy. This movie feels very similar to the first movie in both tone, story, and scares. This movie does a lot of the same things that the first movie did, just bigger, but it's still the same thing. Somebody gets dragged, stuff gets moved around, you see a shadow, you hear the same demon scream, you hear bangs on the wall and floor. The movie slowly tries to drastically or gradually shows these scares getting drastically worse and worse and worse over the course of the movie. It's also a similar camera setup. We want to capture paranormal activity. Um, there's these long, quiet scenes and then a loud, boisterous noise, and the movie ends in a similar bleak, downbeat feel. It's good, like, it's entertaining and well done, but you can just tell that this is one of those, like, Godzilla Raids Again or Jaws 2 type of sequels. It's a lot of the same shit that happens in the first movie done all over again with a bigger budget. It is, again, well done, and it's not, like, as bad as, like, Jaws 2 or Terminator 3, for example, which is one of the biggest examples of a copycat sequel. It's just doing all the same shit that its predecessor was doing all over again just to make the same success. Now, sure, this movie was still a success, but coming off of the first movie, similar to Halloween 2, this kind of feels less like a Paranormal Activity 2, but more like a Paranormal Activity 1.5 or Saw point 0.5, or like in Saw point 0.5's example, maybe a Paranormal Activity point 0.5. Um Now again, it's entertaining, it's well made, it's well done. It does good things that a good sequel should do. But, just watching these movies, because like I did, I watched Paranormal Activity again after I reviewed it, and then a couple days later I watched this movie. I could feel the similarities pretty strongly. So it just felt like the producers were like, "Okay, everything that the first movie did, do that all over again with $3 million in this movie." It just feels a bit not lazy per se, but it kind of does feel a little rushed. And especially since this movie was made in only 3 weeks, or shot in 3 weeks, I should say, it does feel a little bit rushed. But not bad by any means. And overall, this isn't a bad movie in the slightest. It's a good sequel. It's a good installment. It does a lot of things right. Still, though, it's not my favorite. I would actually say so far, it might be my second least favorite of the Paranormal Activity movies, or maybe third. Like I said, I need to reevaluate these movies, so it's hard for me to really say right now if it's my second least favorite, but it's not as good as the first movie. It's not as scary or gripping or engaging as the first film. Good sequel, just not as good as the first movie. So I will be giving this movie a 7.5 out of 10. I do recommend it, obviously, because it's the first sequel, and a lot of things that the franchise does later on, a lot of that was started in this movie. So you have to give this movie credit for that. But still, it's not my favorite. Post your comments down below and let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and share this video with your friends. And as always, go out and if you install cameras around your house to capture criminal activity, you might just capture some paranormal activity. And I will see you guys in the next movie.